So how can I get one success of an extremely gifted person and make that accessible to a person who is just average?
Hey there, I'm Stephan Kesting, and this is the Strenuous Life Podcast. So hello everyone, super special guest today, Carlos Machado. So I'm just super thrilled to be sitting and talking with you today. I think you're a fantastic storyteller to start with, and you've got so much knowledge in the area of Jiu Jitsu, so I think this will be a real special treat for the listeners.
Thank you so much for your invitation. It's an honor to be at your podcast, and I'm here just to share what I can and contribute to our common goal to improve and send a good positive message to our jiu-jitsu and martial arts friends and students.
That's absolutely the goal. So, of course, are you the oldest of the five Machado brothers?
Uh-huh.
Okay. So I've met three of the others. I have never met you before, so it's fantastic for me. But what was it like growing up in a jiu-jitsu family with four brothers? I'm sure you get asked this all the time, but it's the first time I've talked to you, so I'm going to ask the same questions as everyone else.
Yeah. Okay, so all of us started at the age of 4 or 5 year old, so we kind of got exposed to jiu-jitsu and carried it on as eventually a career in itself up to now. And being with the brothers means you gotta move the coffee table out of the way, even if you don't have mats, you improvise on the carpet, because we have a lot of conversations that we carry on beyond the mat, and it kind of follows us wherever we go. Every house we lived, we used to have mats as well in our houses, in addition to any other schools that we attended to. The siblings were a motivation, because if one of us stopped training, we knew that the other ones would be catching up to us and we would be lagging behind. So we kept each other in check in a positive way. You know, other than that, I think we've been motivational. Each of our successes at different times, whether it was competition or different things that we accomplished as martial artists, instructors, or even while we were students as well, would be, for the younger brothers, looking up to the older brothers. For us, actually, as my other younger brothers like John and Jean-Jacques start to grow into the ranks and accomplish on their own right tremendous success with their careers, it came the other way around. Like the older brothers would look up to our younger brothers. You know? So it was a good reference, especially when we decided to come to America as well.
So you decided to come to America as a group?
Higan was the one that opened the way. He came in 1988, and a couple of years earlier than me. Me and my brother John followed suit in 1990. And then Jean-Jacques and Roger came a couple of years at a later time. So we almost at the same time, but Higan is the one that has been somewhat of a pioneer. You know, he's the one that opened the way.
So when you say you started jiu-jitsu at 4, I often get emails or questions from people who are worried about a curriculum for 4-year-olds. I know playing with my own kids when they were that age, there was no curriculum. There's just playing and learning through playing. So there's sort of two different approaches. How were you?
Yeah, I think most of us now use structure, and I think it's wiser to do so if you are to accomplish certain goals and set goals to our students. But in my case, in the case of my brothers, it was the sheer amount of time on the mat, the training, and not just the instruction that we received from our cousins, but also our own pursuit with each other, brainstorming and challenging the techniques and trying to perfect them with one another. So that became somewhat of a common denominator amongst my brothers, that we would always try to find answers to each other's problems with one another. You know.
Because of course you guys were also going and training with other people other than just yourselves.
Sure.
What schools were you training at?
Well, actually at that time, most schools would come to train with us. We didn't go, my school originally, when I started my path, Rolls Gracie was a school I used to attend up to Blue Belt. But I was I was already transitioning to training with my cousin, Carlos Gracie Jr., at the time of Hall's death. And then Carlos Gracie Jr. became the lead instructor at the academy after Hall's passed. And from there, he changed locations and created the Gracie Barra, which
So
now
Gracie Barra didn't exist.
didn't
at that point.
exist then. Yeah, and so we came along with them. We became instructors as well, Gracie Barra, and founding instructors. We actually became partners as well, which ended upon the time we came to America. But I remember often, Hickson, would come and train with us. Sometimes we would go and train with Hickson. We always try to interact and exchange with one another. It was not uncommon for some of the top Alliance students at the time, Fabio Gurgel, Roberto Travin, to come by our gym occasionally to train. So it was almost like a magic time. We didn't have that much division. There was somewhat of a unity that everybody wanted to grow, and.
It wasn't as popular then either.
Yeah, of course. I think the popularity of Jiu-Jitsu, you can earmark, the before and after the UFC, when Royce fought the first time in 1993. Of course, Roy and Gracie coming to the U.S. Earlier on and doing the Gracie Challenge and kind of marketing his biggest interview at the time. I remember they had a centerfold, several pages on the Playboy magazine, kind of brought Jiu-Jitsu mainstream. You had the Jiu-Jitsu scenes, the Mel Gibson's movie Lethal Weapon, the first couple ones. He finishes Gary Busey with a triangle.
Yeah, while hanging from a chain.
Yeah, so, all those things were happening. And then you had Chuck Norris.
Oh, sorry, I got that wrong. He wasn't hanging. He finished James Liu hanging from a chain, I think.
Yes.
And then Gary Busey was a big fight in the front yard.
Yes, but the point of the matter is Jiu-Jitsu was then, for the first time, getting some sort of exposure, which nowadays you see John Wick or Keanu Reeves, they even term now gun-jitsu, because he grapples with a gun, and it's kind of like all cool fight scenes, became prevalent. But going back to your question in regards to, I think you were saying, I kind of got lost, if you can rephrase.
Just for very young kids, sort of in the age 4 or 5.
Curriculum.
Yeah, just...
Okay, so for me, I think it's unfair to a student to start without an end in sight. That doesn't mean that you're going to get it, but you got to have somewhat of a roadmap. And I think back in the old days, it was easier or more convenient or less troublesome for an instructor. Sometimes they would say for you to advance in rank, you'd have to win at least 2 major tournaments under the same rank, and then the instructor would acknowledge you another rank. Or some other times they would say, you only get, let's say if you're a blue belt, you're not going to get to purple unless you're tapping out all the blue belts in the room. So those expectations were kind of vague, because if you do that today, nowadays, there's no telling
if you're a 55-year-old
criteria will fly, Now, the other part, on the fun part with kids, the thing about ranking, I think it's very important and necessary to have a structure, but at the same time do it in a way that the fun and the sense of competence exists. Because otherwise it becomes like trivial or too easy or too watered down. I think it defeats the purpose. You should build something stronger and better, not something more organized and of a lesser quality.
Now, for me to jump back, you mentioned that you trained with Halls up to blue belt. Do you have many memories of Halls?
Yeah, well, what happened, I was 16 years old, and of course, quite some. I used to live at one point in time with my uncle, late Carlos Gracie, his dad, and Halls would have lunch with us almost daily. We had this long table where some of my other cousins and my brother Higgin then was living with us as well. And it was not uncommon, but I didn't get to share as much the mat time with Halls as I wish I did. Unfortunately, we never knew that his life would be cut short that young.
I guess he was in his prime.
Yeah, he was 32 at his passing, but he was an adventurer. He liked. I think when I look back, and if I can explain my understanding at a later time why things happened the way they happened, Halls always wanted to challenge himself anytime he felt any sense of fear. So he always liked to ride fast motorcycles, to surf big waves, and eventually he fell in love with hang gliding, which eventually was what caused him to have his fatal accident. So He's one of those individuals that may have a short stay in this world, but the amount of time
impact
that they spent does not just, I wouldn't say doesn't do justice for the revolution and impact that he has caused upon so many, you know.
So what do you think his contributions were to jiu-jitsu?
Well, Halls was a pioneer in the sense that he was a black belt in judo, very accomplished judo black belt. He also started doing wrestling, freestyle wrestling. He traveled the world. He was, got into sambo wrestling. He used to box. He started to kind of expand the horizons in terms of bringing into jiu-jitsu some of those elements that sometimes were not yet taken because we're kind of more specialized on a single ground working, approach, ground fighting. And he kind of blended it all. And, nowadays it's commonplace, especially with the mixed martial arts. If you're a jiu-jitsu practitioner and you go into the UFC, you got to know the striking, you got to know the wrestling and so on. He was already kind of like a precursor of that back then.
When I talk to people who trained in the very early jiu-jitsu scene, especially the very first guys to come to California, they talked about, that you would only do closed guard at those schools. And that closed guard, why would you open your closed guard? And then when some of those same guys started training with the Machados, they were like, oh, you can open your guard. You can do this open guard stuff. And then it was kind of a revolution. So, of course, that's a simplification. Sure. But do you think that the Machado game, insofar as it's distinct from the more Gracie game, was more open guard oriented?
I think this is very susceptible to interpretation because jiu-jitsu has become so universal. And it's almost like we all come, we have that root, that common root, but some of us might favor or tend to go towards a certain way of doing things in a different way. And it's not limited to me and my brothers. I think even so today, when you see amongst everybody else, some guys do more of a closed guard game. If you see my cousin Rolls Gracie, for instance, man, you fall into his closed guard, you're up for a long day because he has such a precise game from that point on. But then you have guys that have incredible open guard with arm drags like Marcelo Garcia. He's like a, short, and does the arm drags, the butterfly guard. So I think my brothers and I always kind of like tended to do the butterfly guard. We always kind of felt inclined to work those kind of guards. So for us, it was not that difficult to kind of go that way. But that doesn't mean that we changed the system or created a new system within it. We just, I think, exploited one angle that was more appealing to us. Let's put it this way,
So in terms of changing the game or the game changing over time, what are sort of the evolutions within jiu-jitsu that you've seen and that you think are good and that you think are bad?
Well, I think jiu-jitsu, evolution for me is not more, it's refinement, but I see, for instance, there are two currents. One, it may rely more on athleticism, on acrobatic kind of like a skill set. Other kind of like core techniques, more old school, more fundamental, more basic that anybody can do, whether it's an average Joe or an accomplished, athlete. So the dilemma here is how we can foster students to venture into expanding their techniques and experimenting with different things, but at the same time, not to neglect the very thing that makes the core of the art. You know what I'm saying? So for me, as long as you don't rely on athleticism or acrobatic, skills, but even if you have those, that's a plus, but that's not what molds the art. I think jiu-jitsu has to thread in a way, and the other thing about simplifying is when you look back at what you learn, and that's my challenge at this point in time, I don't just look to what's happening now and try to learn everything that happens from any angle, from any source. I look back at how I learned compared to what I know in terms of experience, and after training for so long, how can I make myself a better white belt if I was a white belt now? How can I make myself a better blue belt if I was a blue belt now? So what are the things that were giving me trouble that I can track back in those times that with the knowledge that I have today, the white belts that I form will never have to go through some of the difficulties, not because there aren't challenges, but difficulties because there was not enough knowledge on how to make the technique more effective or more accessible for them from the start.
Can you give us an example of a couple of techniques?
I give you several. I'll give you an example. For instance, if you're doing an up escape from the mount, all right? A lot of times I was never explained about the use of lines. For instance, if you have somebody on top of you and his head is aligned with your head, it's kind of like a 50-50. If his head is off to one side and you're trying to flip him to the opposite side, he has the advantage. So for me, my whole pursuit will be, how can I make his head move towards the side where it aligns with the shoulder from the side I'm turning and flipping him over? So you see people at different times try to just do the upa and then roll the guy. And sometimes guys are great at that. Some other times it works to an extent and then it doesn't work as well. And then you have the thing about people talk about, what do you do against a bigger opponent? And that intrigues me, because for me, the technique well done and with the right adjustment, it serves no matter who you're going against. That doesn't change the fact that you may have to adjust certain things in order to make it more powerful or more powerfully effective. But that doesn't mean that you have to change your technique altogether because you have a bigger guy instead of a skinnier one.
I suppose there are some people, and they almost don't make good teachers, who just do these things instinctively. Like you were talking about lining up your center line with your opponent's center line and playing with that for the upa escape from mount. And some people are just, for whatever reason, going to do that without thinking about it because they're kinesthetically gifted. But you're trying to take your understanding and make it so that anybody can learn it.
All right, so we can't base the rule on the exception. We have to make the average above average, if that makes any sense. I cannot pick one person that's extremely gifted, that automatically adapts and molds into the movement compared to somebody who doesn't have the same gift. So how can I make that? How can I get one success of an extremely gifted person and make that accessible to a person who is just average? Mm-hmm. You know, the only way I can do is by explaining the physics. That way they understand they don't have to be stronger or more flexible. If they understand about alignment of the body, they can replicate with a higher degree of success whatever technique, you know, that alignment will make easier for them.
Who are the most athletically gifted athletes in the jiu-jitsu space that you've ever worked with? It's a little bit of a different question from saying who's the best, because the best would be technical, but just for pure athleticism.
All right, so you can take in categories. For instance, if you talk about jiu-jitsu specifically, of course, you know, having memory of Rolls Gracie at the time, you know, in his prime, he was above people of his time. You know, for instance, I can tell you, like, when we went to the beach, and we were all in good shape and stuff, but we didn't have the knowledge that we do today, or how to take better care of our bodies, how to condition better, and all those things, the cross-training maybe. But Rickson was already doing that. He had the gymnastica natural, the natural movement. He would do a yoga. He would walk on the beach at speed walk. Everybody would go to bake in the sun. He would just bask in the sun. He would just go there. He was always working his body, even when he was on leisure. You know, he had that kind of mission, you know, in pursuit at all times. And so I almost felt like he was fluid like water and like, you know, endless stamina. Out of my brothers, all of them, of course, presented different strengths. My brother Jean-Jacques, for instance, I never remember training with him a short training session. With him, if it was 30 minutes, 45 minutes, non-stop of rolling with him, you consider that short, because he was like a machine. He would go on and on and on and keep the pace really high, always well-conditioned. And he would never be the one to ask first to stop, saying, okay, you know, we had enough. So you would be always upon me. And I said, you know what, I'm tired of rolling with Jean-Jacques, even if I'm not tired. Jean-Jacques, that's good enough, you know. But then you have different categories of athletes that have, for instance, a wrestling background. So they have that Olympic level conditioning. And with the grappling, I guess, experience from wrestling alone and transitioning to jiu-jitsu, they had like a jump start to an extent in regards to, so I have a few wrestlers that have been at my school at different times. I remember Rico Ciparelli, who was in California at the time. I mean, the guy was one of the Don Gable's proteges, and amazing skills. And for him, he got jiu-jitsu he was able to understand the mechanics because he was a very, very refined wrestler.
Really smart guy, too.
Yeah, very intelligent, yeah. Strategic as well, yeah. So,
in terms of the deepest technical knowledge, which is, again, a separate question a little bit from the athleticism, who would you say that you've worked with who has the deepest technical knowledge? It's a dangerous question because you're going to forget somebody.
It's really hard to pinpoint. I can ask my brother Higan any jiu-jitsu equation, and he will come with an answer that I've never heard before. He has the mind of, I wouldn't even say an artist as a martial artist, an artist purely. He can draw. He used to draw pictures of, different drawings of people fighting each other in jiu-jitsu positions and stuff. He could do comic books. He has that gift. And he amazingly extrapolates. Anytime I ask him a simple question, he comes with something much bigger than just the original question. Rickson, in my opinion, has the conceptual. He wouldn't even explain to you a technique, but he would tell something like, if somebody touches your body with a limb and you pull that limb and make that touch your body, then all of a sudden imagine that as part of your body instead of that being the guy's arm. So like for the Upa skate, for instance, if he got a hold of the guy, he would make sure that his chest was glued to the guy's forearm, and no matter where what the guy tried to do to pull the arm out, in his mind he felt it was a limb, which gives you the theory of the octopus in jiu-jitsu. The octopus.
Theory of the octopus? I've never heard this.
Yes. The octopus is you have 2 arms and 2 legs. I have 2 arms and 2 legs. But once you start grappling, your limbs become mine. So all of a sudden I have 8 pieces.
That's really cool. I've never heard that before.
Yeah. So it has all to do with the connection, but anyhow, this is something as an example that Rickson has covered. And myself, I like to talk in concepts. I was talking to John Danaher in New York, and we're just talking. This was Georges St. Pierre had this fight recently against Michael Bisping a couple months ago.
Amazing comeback.
Yeah, I know, no kidding. And we're not talking about techniques. We're just talking about alignment. How to align the body, and then from that point on, there's connection, and from that connection, there's control. From that control, there's position. So one thing precedes the other. So a lot of times when you're talking about a technique in itself, the technique that's described on YouTube video, for instance, is what's on the shelf. Not on the shelf, on the window, on the glass window. That's what you see. The concept behind that people don't even know what is being thought before the technique takes place is what makes everything click. When Rickson talks about invisible jiu-jitsu, in my opinion, that's what he's talking about. If you push Rickson, he keeps his heels off the ground, to keep his balance. He doesn't have his foot flat. If somebody touches him to do a choke on him or any self-defense move, I was watching one of his clips one time, his heel is off the ground because that leans his body slightly forward just enough that if the guy tries to push him right away, he's not going to be surprised and lose his balance in the process. So those little things, if your eye is not trained, if you don't have the conceptual thinking, you can detect. You can show the same picture to 2 individuals, one without conceptual thinking and the other one just the see through the window kind of observation. And it's like you can mark. The conceptual guy will mark every little thing that he can see. Like when you grab, when I'm doing escapes from the bottom, the UPA, I don't grab with my hands, I grab with my fingertips. Because I felt if I have my fingertips, this little inch between my last knuckle and my fingertip, is what can keep me breathing when somebody's trying to push all the way
Okay.
the forearm against my neck. You know what I'm saying? So that way, just an example, small stuff. The small, that's what it makes it bigger, you know.
Well, there's an old saying that if you give a man a fish, you feed him for one day. If you teach a man how to fish, you feed him for his whole life. And I think in some ways, teaching conceptually is teaching a man how to fish, because if he learns the concept, then he can go and learn a new technique very quickly, or figure out some technique that, you know, that he needs in that moment.
Agreed. Well, I can add something to this real quick. When people talk about concept on the instruction, a lot of times back in the old days, I used to teach, trying to explain the technique. So you're trying to appeal to the person's intellect. So he has to interpret your words first, then translate that into the reaction that you expect of his muscles and nerves. So there's like 3 or 4 different steps that have to take place before the technique is understood and actually executed. So, for instance, I have one stance that I do of a guard pass. I call the old man holding a tray. Old man kind of bent forward, so the elbows are close to the hip. Holding a tray means your wrists are, you know, turning away, that your elbows are tight, so there's no room for the guy to attack your arm, to do anything that's going to affect much your ability to stay there in a safe way. You know what I'm saying? So, old man's pass. If I say that, the students, even if they don't understand any concept, their visual understanding of what I mean, the figure of speech, will be enough to cause their body to be in that position, which is what sets everything up.
Okay. And that's years and years of experience, not only of doing jiu-jitsu, but finding ways to teach jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, you know what's amazing for me is like teaching is about relearning and actually teaching yourself. Every time a student asks me a question or wants to practice a position or does something that I'm not expecting, it forces me to go beyond, I wouldn't even say comfort zone, I would say it forces me to go beyond the limitations of imagine that once you do a technique that's all set in stone. A technique is alive, like breathing, you know what I'm saying? And a lot of times, the nuances and the small things that you can do to adjust it, they keep popping out here and there. It's never ending. And that's why I think it makes jiu-jitsu so fascinating. You'll never be boring for the ones that really want to learn it.
Oh no, I mean, well, what do you think about the sort of the new techniques that come along every couple of years, whether it's 50-50 guard? I mean, of course it's not new. Somebody put somebody in 50-50 guard 1,000 years ago. Yeah. But in terms of developing a whole game around it, 50-50, berimbolo, the whole leg lock craze, especially with no gi. So do you try and steer your students away from that, towards that?
I think you have to be exposed in order to understand, so you can be aware and effective in case somebody wants to apply that to you. Try to put your head in a hole like an ostrich, you know, and pretend that doesn't exist. I think it's a mistake. You want to deal with your enemy, learn what your enemy does, you know, art of war. And I'm not saying anybody's an enemy if they're doing something different, but I do think, though, one thing has to do with purpose, the other one has to do with outcome, all right? What's the purpose of the 50-50 guard? If it's for you to evolve your game, to get a submission, to get a sweep, that's awesome. If it's just to stall, that's self-defeating. You know what I'm saying? The leg attacks. I think leg attacks, when you do a tournament like the BI format, it becomes a very important aspect of it, because I feel, especially some of the guys that have developed that, you know, like you see the Danaher squad and some of the guys from 10th Planet and different people, Craig Jones from Australia, different people get more equipped to fight any submission attempts above the waist. But once you have strong game below the waist, it's even easier for you to actually set up both. Right. I've seen guys going from omoplata to set up a toe hold, you know, so you can kind of go high and low. Helio Gracie, later Helio Gracie, he didn't have the berimbolos or the heel hooks, but he had a vicious ankle lock and a vicious collar choke, X choke. So he would get somebody on the choke. If the guy postured up, he would set up an ankle lock, you know. So I think it just increased the dimension. But if it's self-defeating in the sense that it's just for you to stall or prevent somebody from getting points on you, then I don't think it's where I think jiu-jitsu should go.
So you're not pro getting one advantage point and then stalling for the whole rest of the match?
Well, I can understand the advantage for the fact that some of these tournaments get so many people competing at a point in time that if you don't have a better criteria and then there are no points, which happens quite often in some instances, I have to do overtime over and over again and stuff. So it's something that I think it's a sign of the popularity, you know. But I do think they can do more about the stalling, though, you know. And I think if stalling was more severely penalized, or if they actually score points for submission attempts, those two things could put some spice into the game, you know.
What do you think about the submission-only formats?
I think I like the idea because I think, for instance, though, if you watch the EBI, the time frame is like, what, 7 minutes? Something like that. It's not even 10 minutes. I don't even know how long that is. I forgot the exact rounds. But, and then from that, you add the tiebreaker where you start from a submission situational position and then go from there. Yeah. When you have two athletes, they're super qualified, well-conditioned, well-trained, sometimes 7 minutes may not be enough for you to breach into each other's defense. You know, if one guy chooses just to stay defensive for the whole time and the other one attacking, I guess I'm not sure if they have a criteria to favor whoever shows more aggressiveness or initiative.
Depends on the tournament.
I like to see overtimes instead of going for the situational tiebreakers, you know.
Yeah. I think maybe, and I haven't thought about this a lot, but maybe you need both formats. Maybe you need the submission-only format to teach guys to go for submission, but then you need a point-based positional system as well, like the IBJJF.
You know what I would love? You know what I would love?
What would you love?
You can make the IBJJF up to semifinal, but all the finals are submission only.
Okay.
Wouldn't that be great?
So you'd have to be able to play in both areas.
No, what happens is if you're going to reach the finals, you're likely to be in one of the top brackets or one of the best in the division, period, right? What best way to gift the audience? Okay, in this case right now, points don't count.
And you're going to just see a war.
It's only submission. So then you wouldn't give anybody a reason to hold back, and probably be one of the most exciting matches ever. I mean, I'm just being here, you know.
It should be tried.
You know?
Maybe it'll work.
Yeah.
I mean, I think there's a value to points when it comes to self-defense because the points reflect.
Yeah, of course.
A self-defense hierarchy. It's better to be in mount than it is to be on the bottom of side mount.
Sure.
So, and that's not really reflected in the EBI submission-only thing. So you have guys who really don't care about guard in a sense, or they spin upside down, or they're not hunting for the position.
I saw that, and I think everything is subjective to the format and what's the outcome. Yeah. You can be in superior advantage 6 minutes and 30 seconds, and in the last 30 seconds, the guy pulls a heel hook on you. That's all that matters, you know?
Well, we're running out of time here, but I did want to pick your brains about competing. Am I right that you competed in the first Abu Dhabi?
I think it was in 2000, maybe the second or third, I'm not sure.
So what was that like? Early Abu Dhabi, anyway.
I think Abu Dhabi is a major progression in terms of tournament format. I think also it became a major way to market jiu-jitsu because it was kind of like, you know, they would invite big names. They start to cross the mainstream, like, you know, getting UFC fighters, you know, like Tito Ortiz, you know, all these different guys from Pride, Japan that fought Sana Kikuta and so on. So you have like Takeo Gomi, you know, so you have like
Mike Van Arsdale.
all these different guys were actually UFC fighters. They were like in the roster of MMA organizations, but they had the wrestling, you know, capability and stuff. So all grappling, you know, and they're top level athletes. So I think it was, in a sense, refreshing to see such a large scale initiative from the Prince, you know, in the Emirates. From participants, I think it was great too. I had not tried to make an excuse. I had an injury on one of my ankles prior to competing, so I had to do what I could to just hang in there. It was fun. I saw my brother Jean-Jacques having quite some success. For me, it was inspiring to see him, winning the division, winning the open class, and so on.
That was an amazing performance.
Yeah. So I think he put no-gi definitely on the map as well.
I think there were no other major no-gi. That was certainly the biggest no-gi tournament
At
to that time.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much for taking this half hour and sharing with us some of the stories.
It was a pleasure meeting you. It was a pleasure sharing the time with you. I hope this is the first of many.
Podcast listeners, if you found this interesting or useful or entertaining, please pass this episode on to somebody else in your social circle or in your training circle. Surely there's somebody else out there who would also find it interesting. This is the way the podcast grows. It's an organic growth by people like you passing it on to their friends and the people that they know. I really, really appreciate this kind of sharing. So thank you so much in advance and good luck with your training.